Hi, I'm Johnny Rains, a clinical psychologist here at University Hospitals Bristol and Weston, and this is a talk on developing your resilience. It's one of a series of talks that you're probably aware of, and how come you've tuned into this as part of Living Well with Advanced Cancer. So it's written very much with that audience in mind, but actually resilience is something that applies to lots of us. So this will be relevant too if you're the partner or family member or friend of someone living with advanced cancer. And actually it's probably relevant too if you're just someone living with a different kind of life-limiting condition. Now, I've had many conversations over the years, and one of the things that people often say to me is, Johnny, I'm not sure that I can deal with this. They doubt their own ability to manage the impact of this on them psychologically, emotionally, personally. And here's the thing, resilience isn't something that we're born with. We don't come into this situation necessarily with the resilience we need, because resilience is about coping with adversity. It's what you find within yourself when you're dealing with the challenges. Now, there's a good side to this, or two good sides to it. The first is, this means you're not a beginner at this. You will have had tough times in the past, things that have felt huge obstacles to overcome, and you'll have found a way to do that. So everyone comes into this situation with their own store of resilience and coping strategies already, even if it feels like you've lost sight of them just at the moment. The second thing that's the sort of good side to this is what resilience is it's not a personality type. It's not that some people are just born resilient and others aren't. It's something that we all have within us, and it's a question of finding it and developing it. So what I'm going to do in this talk is say a little bit more about what resilience is, and then talk about two ways that might be helpful to you in developing your resilience. So what does it look like? Is it like this? This is an idea that a lot of people have, that resilience is somehow being strong, standing up to things, the immovable object that's unaffected by what's going on around it. And something like an oak tree is a good representation of that. But actually, that's much more the definition of resistance. And there's a problem with resistance. What happens when it meets the irresistible force? This is a picture of Kent after the great storm of 1987, which I guess many folk watching will remember. Trees, oaks blown over, felled, destroyed. 7 oaks famously became 1 oak. So this is the problem with thinking about resilience as a kind of resistance. When you meet too great a challenge, it can feel like it's going to break you. But there's a different type of tree, the type of tree that adapted and evolved to survive hurricanes. And those are palm trees. And you can see in this image, this is what palm trees do. They don't resist. They have some flexibility to be able to bend, and in that way survive the hurricane. So an image that physicists often use to describe resilience is a spring, because what springs can do is be pulled out of shape and then return from that. Springs can be compressed, pulled, twisted, bent. And in human terms, all of that being twisted and pulled, that's like suffering, like being hurt, anxious, upset. And resilience is about that happening and not being broken by it, so still being you. And in the moment that the pressure relents a bit, it stops twisting you so much that you can return to somehow feeling a bit more the normal you. So what we need to develop for resilience is flexibility. Now, there are lots of ways you can develop flexibility, and I'm going to talk about just 2 of them. So this isn't the complete list, and there are other things I'm sure you do that help you cope, and those will be excellent things to keep doing. But I'm going to talk about 2 particular things that perhaps are not so well recognized. And the first way is about acting with your values. And I'd like to explain this by telling you about someone that I worked with that I've called Robert. I have changed his personal details here, but the key elements are actually true. Now, Robert was a 46-year-old part-time business advisor. He had some children, but he was divorced, lived on his own. He really loved his job, and he loved country walks. And then he was diagnosed with advanced lung cancer. And at the time that I saw him, he didn't actually have too many symptoms, although he could quickly get breathless if he exerted himself, and he tired quite readily. And he said to me, his words were, "Johnny, I feel like normal life has stopped." Work had taken him all over the country, and he no longer had the energy for that, and he certainly couldn't climb a hill. He said, what on earth am I supposed to do? I feel like I'm waiting to die. Now, here's the thing about values. We can think of them a bit like a compass. So when you're traveling, you can set a destination or you can set a direction. So you can think about going to Paris or you can think about traveling east. And goals in life, activities, outcomes, achievements, things that we aim for, these are all like destinations. And the truth is, we may or may not get there. But directions, like traveling east, are something that you can always do no matter how far or short a distance you're traveling. And in that sense, values are like setting a direction rather than a destination. And having a direction is flexible because you're not tying yourself to whether or not you accomplish any particular thing, get to any particular destination. So in Robert's case, he was struggling because things that mattered to him were like destinations. It was being able to work in the way that he was used to, traveling around the country, seeing people in person. It was being able to go to the hills of South Wales and climb them, and those things were not going to happen. This is a reality. And of course, that's tough. But if he's focused on what he can't do, he's losing sight of his values. So how do we get back in touch with values and with setting a direction for ourselves? There are kind of two different ways you can approach this, both of which I think are worth considering. First is this. We can think about values as the qualities a person most wants to express in his or her day-to-day behaviors. So just think about that for a moment. That's an aspect of our behavior, how we do things, not what we do. So you can think about this as trying to express values not as nouns, like independence, but as adverbs, like independently. Not being creative, but creatively, doing things creatively. Whatever you'd say your value is, think about it as an adverb that you could attach as a descriptor to how you do things. So you can pick something that matters to you and think, how would I express it in those terms? Let me go back to Robert. I asked him about his values and he said to me, well, my children. And I get that. I'm a parent too. And if you have children, you probably do feel your children are the most valued thing to you in your life. That's what matters. So of course that's true in a way, but they can't be a value in this sense of the term value. Children are other people. They can't be an aspect of our behavior. So to get to what's of value about children with Robert, I put it to him like this. Okay, your children matter to you. So how are you? What are you like when you're with them, being at your best, being the best dad that you can be? And he said, well, that's when I'm behaving thoughtfully, compassionately, openly. That's really what expressing this value of my children looks like. So I was able to translate it into, here's how I do things. I need to think about living my life like that. And this had really practical consequences for him. One of his daughters was traveling every weekend to come and help him. Because of his breathlessness, she would do some shopping, she would do some of the heavy housework. And he thought, hang on a sec, this isn't what I want her to be doing or what I want our relationship to be like. So he said, actually, one of the things I'm going to do is employ a carer for a few hours a week, because that means I can be more thoughtful and compassionate with her, and the time that we have is spent on the things that matter. So that's one way of thinking about values and setting a direction for yourself. This is a different definition that's also useful, I think. What makes things important to you? So for Robert, country walks, for example, which he had really loved, these were about being in nature, finding peace and quiet. So just thinking about that, going to the mountains of Wales might be his best way of doing that. But if that's not possible, maybe there are some other ways he could be in nature, find some peace and quiet. And you know what he came up with? Because he was someone who lived fairly near to Weston, actually. He would drive to the coast and just sit there. And here was his key. He went on a rainy day because he said, if you go when it's rainy, it's quiet. No one goes to the seafront then. I get my peace and quiet quite readily in a place that I wouldn't have expected. So that's the flexibility, trying to work out what makes this important to me and how could I get a bit of that in this situation. Let's talk about Robert's job. I said, okay, so what made this important to you? And he explained that it was rewarding because for him, it was about sharing his knowledge. He had some very specific areas of expertise within business advice, and he felt good about sharing that knowledge. And he said it made him feel useful. So having worked out it was about sharing knowledge and being useful, what he did was he wrote a short guide to his area of technical expertise, and he made that available for people online as a download. He said, okay, I can't go there, I can't talk with people, but I can still do this thing that makes it important to me. So that's a way in which he was starting to apply values to his life, setting a direction. So that's one way of having flexibility. Here's the second way that I want to talk about. The second way of growing resilience is about making room for your unwanted thoughts and feelings. And by unwanted, what I mean are those thoughts and feelings that you'd really rather not have, but just show up anyway. And I guess that most folk watching this have quite a lot of thoughts and feelings showing up that they'd really rather not have. And I'd like to explain about making room for these by talking about another person that I met. And again, I've changed the personal details, but the story's true. I've called this person Jean. Now, Jean was a retired teacher. She was age 70. She had 2 daughters and 3 grandchildren, and she was very involved in her family life, and particularly one of her daughters who had quite serious mental health problems. So Jean had always had to be very involved in looking after her and very involved in looking after that daughter's daughter. And then Jean was diagnosed with advanced esophageal cancer. And when we were talking, one of the things that I picked up on were her unwanted thoughts and feelings. And the 2 most common ones were these. She said, I keep seeing my daughter at my funeral and it's awful. My daughter will be so upset. And these thoughts, they just kept coming round to her. So sometimes our feelings are telling us that we need to do something. A lot of people try and bottle these things up rather than letting them out. They feel that's their best way of going forwards. But maybe we've had those feelings and thoughts for a reason. And often that reason is actually there's a conversation that we need to have, and it's talking to the people that we love. So in Jean's case, she hadn't talked to her daughter or her husband about how she was feeling, about what was really worrying her, which was she was trying not to see how things might happen when she's not around. So they hadn't had a conversation about, okay, she's been such an important figure for her daughter, and her daughter's going to need help, and it's not going to be Jean. And what are they going to do about that? So having a conversation about some really difficult stuff, because that's a reality that they're going to have to face. And her feelings keep coming back because that's something that she was going to have to think about and address. But even when you've done that and had those conversations, some thoughts seem to just keep showing up and going round and round in our heads. And we tend to try and deal with them by avoiding them or pushing them away or telling ourselves to be positive, which is okay if that works. But often it doesn't. Those thoughts and unwanted feelings, they just keep coming back, and we get very caught up in our efforts to stop them. So for Jean, even after she'd had some useful conversations about what might practically help her family, she kept having thoughts and pictures of her daughter at her funeral and feeling very sad. And this thought, my daughter will be so upset. And that's probably true. Her daughter probably was going to be very upset. After all, if you love someone, you're going to grieve, and that's how it feels. So it's understandable. I'm not trying to say this isn't realistic, but the going round and round starts getting in the way of her living with her values and making the most of the time that she's got. And I want to help you understand this process a bit more before getting into really how you'd handle those thoughts. So let me introduce you to your amygdala. It's the part of your brain responsible for reacting in an emergency. Its job is to look out for threats and tell you when it can see one. And when it does, it triggers the fight or flight response, which you might have heard of, which involve the emotions of anxiety and anger. So anytime you're feeling anxious, your amygdala has spotted something that it doesn't like. Amygdala is Latin for almond, and that's the size and shape of it. That's why it was called the amygdala. It's a small almond-sized bit of your brain. So it's quite small, and it's quite small because its job is quite simple in some ways. It's there to sound the alarm. So you can think of your amygdala as your worried friend. She wants to keep you safe, but her motto is better safe than sorry. So she will keep sounding the alarm. So one of the really tough things about living with cancer is that your amygdala will tend to keep sounding that alarm, which means that you will tend to keep having thoughts and feelings that you don't want. This is the reason that trying to stop them or argue about it or tell yourself to be positive doesn't tend to work. So what else can you do? Well, a very different way of responding is to try being an observer of how your brain works. So when the thought comes up and you notice it, you can add in the words, I notice my amygdala is telling me. So Jean would say, I notice my amygdala is telling me my daughter will be so upset. You can try this now with one of your own frequent worries if you want to. Think of what that frequent thought is that just keeps showing up and try saying, my amygdala tells me, and then say the worry. Perhaps that feels just a bit easier than when you simply do the worrying. You can put this in different ways. My mind is giving me the thought that, or just now I notice my brain is having a thought that. And then adding the unwanted thought at the end of the sentence. Sometimes we call this way of doing things labeling our thoughts. And it might sound funny to say this or say things in this way, but actually you're speaking the truth. These thoughts happen automatically because of our amygdalas, because of the way our brains and minds work. And what you are actually doing is noticing them. The point of saying it in this way is to put some distance between you and the thought so that you don't get caught up in it in the same way. When you have the thought, it's like you're right up close with it. And when you express it in this way of just now I notice my brain is having a thought, it's like you're putting a bit of distance between you and the thought. And that tends to make those thoughts feel a bit less overwhelming, at which point it can help you to be able to refocus on your values, do that other part of resilient, flexible being. Dealing with thoughts in this way probably won't stop them from happening. After all, you have a healthy, functioning amygdala, and it's going to keep doing its job. But if we imagine these thoughts a bit like traffic, the aim is to let them pass through rather than getting stuck in our heads like a great traffic jam. And if they pass through, then sometimes maybe the roads get quiet and you notice it's becoming a bit more peaceful. Now, these things are much easier said than done, but I hope that's given you some idea about resilience, that it's something you can develop in yourself, and that one way of approaching it is to find ways of being more flexible, be like the palm tree, not the oak. Using values, not goals, to guide what you do, and noticing and labeling unwanted thoughts to help them pass through. Thank you.